must all get ready now.
In these United States to publish horror comics, I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them.
This man is William Gaines, owner of EC Comics, and at the moment, he is being cooked by a gaggle of suits for producing these. Yes, horror comics, namely Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, Weird Science, and Tales from the Crypt came under fire from conservative politicians, angry parents, and Dr. Frederick Wertham. And much like when the Hays Code was enacted in the early 30s against movies with mature and dark subject matter, this Senate hearing directly resulted in the Comics Code Authority, a banner of self-censorship posed by comic book companies that would ultimately snuff out most horror comics on the market by the mid-50s. Gaines' company would take the largest hit. Other comic book publishers had superhero and funny animal strips to fall back on. And while many will tell you superhero comics still took a hit at the time, horror and crime comics were EC's bread and butter, and they were out. How could a business survive after its flagship product is ripped away from them? Well, if it wasn't for a seed planted a couple years before, the EC company would have fallen through the cracks for sure, and satire would look completely different. In 1952, Harvey Kurtzman had grown restless. Kurtzman had previously worked on EC's war titles, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. He much preferred these to the horror and crime titles edited by Al Feldstein. It's no surprise that EC's horror titles paid better than the war books, but Kurtzman was determined to receive a larger wage. Gaines suggested Kurtzman start a humor book to better supplement his income. Kurtzman chose to lampoon and parody the comics themselves and went to work. The first issue was fully written by Kurtzman himself. Each story spoofs the different types of comics EC published. Hoo-ha! Drawn by Jack Davis, parodied EC's horror titles. Blobs, drawn by Wally Wood, would satirize EC's science fiction titles. Varmint, by John Severin, would spoof westerns. And Gneffs, by Bill Welder, would take on crime stories. The comic book would flounder in sales during its first few issues, and didn't really take off until its fourth issue, with Super Duper Man, a pretty on-the-nose riff of the Man of Steel, but it's a rather amusing parody of Superman by even today's standards, in which the Superman stand-in, Clark Kent, is a dweeby loser akin to Urkel, who is seen leering at women in the bathroom with his X-ray vision, and walking into an occupied telephone booth to change. As Super Duper Man, he is upstaged by superhero turned arch-villain Shazoom, who he coaxes into a fight, destroying several buildings. And finally tells Lois his secret identity to get into her pants, who promptly rejects him. DC took offense to this and threatened EC at the time. Kurtzman and Gaines would not budge, however, and this became the first of many times Mad's satirical works would bring legal trouble. By 1955, the Comics Code had wiped out almost all of EC's other titles, which left Mad as its most profitable by default. But Kurtzman was offered a position as an editor at Pageant magazine, which Kurtzman considered a much better deal than staying at the floundering EC Comics. In order to keep Kurtzman, Gaines suggested turning Mad itself into a magazine. Mad's 24th issue would start its new life as a magazine. This would also free it from any restrictions from the Comics Code, because technically, it wasn't a comic anymore. The Comics Code never truly went away. The stories in EC's remaining titles, as well as newer comics akin to Mad, were rejected by the Code entirely, and eventually, after a particularly infuriating objection involving the sweat on an African-American character in the iconic Judgment Day story, Gaines left the Code and vowed never to work under it again. This left Mad as its only title, and things were starting to heat up there as well. Kurtzman was beginning to miss deadlines. He had taken a pay cut, which, if you remember, pay was the whole reason this got started in the first place, and despite the magazine and EC Comics almost floundering completely due to mounting debts, Kurtzman demanded 51% of the magazine. Covertly, Kurtzman had been working with the owner of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, on a new magazine and had signed over two prominent Mad artists, Jack Davis and Bill Elder. Gaines refused, so Kurtzman took his artists and left the magazine to form Trump. Gaines would rely on Al Feldstein to pick up the pieces that were left after Kurtzman's departure. Feldstein would bring on new artists, Bob Clark, George Woodbridge, Joe Orlando, Mort Drucker, Dave Berg, and Don Martin to pick up the pace. Don Martin being Mad's most popular artist, or as they would call him, Mad's maddest artist. However, Mad's most popular recurring cartoon characters were created by Antonio Prohías, a political cartoonist from Cuba who fled to the United States after accusations of being a spy for the CIA by infamous dictator Fidel Castro began to surface. Antonio's work criticized communism and the back-and-forth warring between the US and Russia during the Cold War. Despite his daughter needing to translate his work, the Mad artists found him amusing and hired him. Spy vs. Spy might be the most recognizable icons from Mad magazine other than Alfred E. Neuman himself. Its violent slapstick gags riffing on the Cold War sentiments at the time are still relevant today. The works of Don Martin and the Spy vs. Spy comics would all get animated shorts in Mad's later stints in television. Another change during the Al Feldstein era, starting with its 30th issue, was changing the What Me Worry Kid, now named Alfred E. Neuman, from a small meme character and small detail on the front cover, to the bona fide mascot of the magazine. The character had appeared in small detail on each cover since the 21st issue. The letters column in the 26th issue humorously showcased the multiple origin stories for the character, along with the many different versions of it over the years. The origin of the What Me Worry Kid lands in old advertisements, and it's fitting that the Mad artist would use the commercial character as a sort of meme due to its contentious relationship with ads.
In the Mad Magazine game, you win by losing all your money.
I lost everything! I win!
The new Mad Magazine game from Parker Brothers.
Mad's relationship with ads is interesting because after their 33rd issue, and aside from the ads of their own products, they didn't have any. Mad took his position as a satirical magazine seriously, which meant they would make fun of anything if they could find humor in it, which meant comic books, movies, TV shows, politics, and advertising.
I wonder if you did have advertisers, who would want to advertise in that?
Well, that's another reason we don't have advertising.
No, I wonder, seriously. Let's think, who would...
Well, certainly the soda companies and the gum companies, I think, would be a prime candidate.
But then we worry because we would hate to have our readers getting cavities because we took ads.
It's okay to rot their mind, but not their teeth.
Gaines was the main driving force for this rule, as both Kurtzman and Feldstein expressed interest in using ads. But Gaines maintained this rule barring a few exceptions. Gaines' reasoning for this may seem to come from a mostly principled place, and I'm not going to take that away from him, but there's a more practical reason given as well. We'd have to improve our packaging. Most advertisers want to appear in a magazine that's loaded with color and has a super slick paper, so you'd find yourself being pushed into producing a more expensive package. You get bigger and fancier and attract more advertisers. Then you find yourself losing some of the advertisers. Your readers still expect the fancy package, so you keep putting it out, but now you don't have any advertising income, which is the reason why you got fancier in the first place. And now you're sunk. Gaines was a businessman at the end of the day, and to keep Mad afloat for nearly 40 years, he took certain precautions. Mad's printing remained in black and white. Mad's regular staff consisted of about 9 to 10 people at a time. The artists worked freelance, and there was lower pay for guest writers wanting to appear in Mad. Despite his lavish vacations for the small group, Gaines developed a reputation for being cheap.
I have seen Bill break up a conference with the entire staff assembled for 2 days to track down a $1.75 telephone call that no one will fess up to making.
Keeping the magazine above water that long required it, because along with the lack of advertising, Mad's frequent brushing with the legal system had to soak up funds. The Mad writers parodied popular songs through a joke songbook. Readers were encouraged to sing the joke lyrics to the sound of the original songs. This managed to tick off the music publishers enough for them to sue EC for $25 million. The court's decision favored Mad for most of the songs except 2. There Is No Business Like No Business and Always, which were considered too close to the original song. Mad had several lawsuits over its mascot Alfred E. Neuman, which all fell through due to the lack of copyright renewals on the character, which made him public domain. Universal took issue with Mad over usage of the Frankenstein monster character for their 89th issue. The Star Wars legal team sent legal threats to Mad despite George Lucas praising the lampoons made by Mad. A similar thing happened to Charles Schulz with Peanuts. Despite enjoying the magazine's work for years, some gung-ho Peanuts lawyers sent letters on his behalf. Mad's satirical edge was really the first of its kind, so in addition to essentially paving the way for song parodies, Mad influenced a generation to create the kind of parody content we're used to seeing today, from Air Pirate Funnies to all the Mad ripoffs, to National Lampoon, to Weird Al, to The Simpsons.
This is against regulations. In this department, we go by the book.
By book.
And that is ultimately the cultural significance of Mad. It wasn't just surviving legal battles, or staying relevant through major shifts in popular culture. It was their irreverent style of humor, an anti-authoritarian point of view, which may have previously only been seen in Warner Brothers cartoons, that truly made the impact, because now it was in the hands of the American youth. I think this article from the New York Times said it best. Mad was the only one that blatantly admitted its trashiness. And not just admitted it, but reveled in it, advertised it, never allowed it to be forgotten, wore it like a badge of honor. Which of course it was. And kids across the country knew it instantly. Kids felt it right from the beginning. Mad told the truth. The article later reads, Mad made public and lent confirmation to tens of thousands of thoughts that kids around the country had been afraid they were crazy for having. It was magical, objective proof to kids that they weren't alone. That in New York City on Lafayette Street, if nowhere else, there were people who knew that there was something wrong, phony and funny about a world of bomb shelters, brickmanship, and toothpaste smiles. Mad's consciousness of itself as trash, as a comic book, as an enemy of the parents and teachers, even as a money-making enterprise, thrilled kids. And with that kind of influence, it's only a matter of time before a goofy joke magazine becomes a fully fledged brand, the likes of which Hollywood execs and producers can fully exploit. In September 1973, Mad reached its peak in sales for one issue. It sold 2.4 million copies. Which is interesting, because it really is just a standard issue of the magazine. It's really a testament to how popular it was at this point. You got your letters column, a couple of wacky ads. In this section titled The Poop Side Down Adventure, they spoof Airport. Gee, isn't that interesting? Except here they are using an ocean liner. In this section they spoof ads for tools against home invasions and muggings. Except the deterrents gradually become more gruesome and deranged. The issue continues with some gags involving Tarzan, a goof on hospitals, and the automotive industry. And of course, taking the piss out of Richard Nixon. More people are probably familiar with this issue, which was released several months later. Its cover is infamous for displaying the middle finger. I imagine that this was an attempt to be more provocative in the same vein as the National Lampoon, which had been out for a few years at this point. But it ended up selling less than usual. The cover dissuaded clerks and store owners from displaying it on their shelves. In 1974, Mad received an animated pilot for ABC, but it was not aired. Execs found the scathing satire of auto brands a little too on the nose. The special is a really good representation of how the magazine works, the auto section and the Godfather parody being the best of the special. There's a lot of social commentary you'd see replicated years later on television shows during the 90s. This healthcare gag is pretty funny because it's true.
Now, why can't you admit this patient? Well, he hasn't been able to tell us his Blue Cross number.
In the 80s, Mad's branding would be lent to Up the Academy, a comedy in the same vein as Police Academy, Meatballs, or Stripes, but it was obviously borrowing the template from National Lampoon's series of movies. The difference being National Lampoon's movies were successful, and this movie bombed, and destroyed any idea of Mad lending its name to films in the future. I mean, it's not a horrible movie. A group of delinquent kids are sent to military school, hijinks ensue, pretty out there gags, a cameo. I think most people are familiar with this movie because it stars Ralph Macchio as Mooch. I mean, it's not comedy gold, but I found it amusing. There would be another attempt at a pilot in the late 80s, but the print seems to be lost to time. But anything is possible, it may resurface someday. I mean, the Boondocks pilot came out this year, anything's possible. By the 90s, Mad once again tried lending its branding, but this time, it was on television. And it was a success. Mad TV, a sketch comedy show in the same vein as SNL or In Living Color, had a successful run of 14 seasons from 1995 to 2009. It wasn't the forefront of comedy like SNL was, and it didn't have the Wayans and Jim Carrey like In Living Color did. It's the least remembered of the three, but with that being said, I definitely have laughed the hardest at this show.
I see.
I grew up watching the skits on YouTube, the Dr. Phil segments, the Stewart sketches, Dot Goddard, and this Jeopardy parody. It's some of the funniest of the series.
He already answered.
No, he didn't. Buzz in, Rodney.
Yeah, but
Rodney, when I say buzz in, you... Oh, Rodney.
Some people may think it's sort of out of left field to produce a sketch show using the Mad TV brand, but SNL itself was heavily inspired by the National Lampoon radio show and magazine. Some of the original talent of SNL's first seasons were taken straight from that show. It seems only natural to make a sketch show based off the original parody and satire magazine too. The series also launched the careers of several prominent comedic actors: Phil Lamar, Jordan Peele, Keegan-Michael Key, and Bobby Lee, just to name a few. I think the most compelling thing from Mad TV though was its bizarre parodies of children's television series like Sesame Street and the Rankin Bass Rudolph special. These precede the likes of Robot Chicken by nearly a decade, which is very interesting considering Mad's next TV show on Cartoon Network would be described as Robot Chicken, but for kids. Cartoon Network's Mad is an attempt to televise the style and format of the magazine, much like the '74 pilot. Crooked ads, comic-style bumpers, parodies of contemporary movies and TV shows, but with a heavy lean on mixed media, stop motion, puppets, 3D and 2D animation, all combining with different styles and artists. It's really excellent. In my opinion, this show captures the sensibilities of the magazine the most. Out of all the different types of media that came out over the years surrounding Mad, this is the most like the source material. The reanimated Spy vs. Spy shorts for this show are good despite the rough animation. I mean, it really has a charm to it. They even recreated Don Martin's cartoons as well. Mad's main segments were these strange fusions of two different pieces of popular media, as opposed to a straight parody. These probably are the segments that age the worst considering the relevancy in popular media changing over the years. But there are some really funny skits in here. The animated segments by M. Martella are the funniest regular segments to come from the series, but the Mad ads are the best segments in general. This is probably the first time a lot of Gen Zers were introduced to any form of satire. I mean, it's not very complex or subtle, but Mad never really was. I remember the SpongeWow commercial specifically being an obvious riff on ShamWow. I still can't believe they called it this.
Machine. Made in Germany. You know the Germans always make good stuff.
That brings us to the modern day. Mad Magazine stopped printing regular issues back in 2018, and in a world where people have access to the internet, most print media is disappearing. Reporters were surprised by Mad's relevance back in the late 80s, when William Gaines and Al Feldstein still ran it. Gaines passed away back in 1992, and Al Feldstein left the magazine in the 80s. And despite the critical voices that started the magazine being absent, contributors like John Ficarra, Nick Meglin, and Joe Raiola were able to keep the magazine running until at least 2018. Mad still exists digitally, but I can't imagine it has the same cultural impact it had back in the day. The world the magazine was created in is long gone, and the Mad banner is now just another brand in Warner Brothers' arsenal. But that doesn't take away from how impactful the magazine was in its peak. It was edgy, subversive, juvenile, gross, and idiotic. It was Mad.
We must all get ready now. Utility of plastic in the master bedroom.